In 1503, a Spanish fleet sailed west, carrying men, women, and supplies, not to find gold, but to stay. Within weeks, they would build the first permanent European settlement in the New World, planting seeds for an empire that would reshape the Americas forever. But here's what textbooks won't tell you. This wasn't a glorious adventure, it was a desperate struggle for survival on islands that would test every limit of human endurance. What started in 1503 with just a handful of settlers would eventually span 2 continents and last for centuries. Today, we explore how a single year changed the course of history. This is the untold story of how permanent European colonization of the Americas began, not with conquest or gold rushes, but with basic survival. Most people know Columbus sailed in 1492, but few understand what happened next. The real story, the one that shaped nations, started 10 years later with decisions made in Madrid and risks taken in the Caribbean. In 1503, Spanish King Ferdinand made a fateful decision. He would send more than just explorers. He would send settlers, soldiers, and enslaved indigenous people. He would establish towns. He would create a system of control that would define the Spanish colonial empire for the next 300 years. The year 1503 marks the crucial turning point between exploration and colonization. Columbus's voyages had proven the route was survivable. The islands held wealth, so Spanish leaders believed. Now came the hard part, figuring out how to make colonization work. How do you keep people alive in tropical diseases and unknown climates? How do you organize settlements on distant shores? How do you extract wealth from land you've only begun to understand? These questions would be answered through trial, error, and tragedy over the coming decades. But the decisions made in 1503 set the template for everything that followed. The Caribbean in 1503 was a world about to transform forever. The indigenous Taino and Lucayan peoples, who had lived peacefully for centuries, had no idea their world was ending. The Spanish crown had no idea they were about to face their greatest colonization challenge yet. And Europe had no idea that the next 500 years would belong to the nations bold enough to cross and shone and stake claims on distant shores. All of this empires, revolutions, the birth of the United States itself traces back to decisions made and actions taken in 1503. Columbus's final voyage ended in 1504, but it left behind a complicated legacy. He had established colonies, yes, but they were struggling. La Isabela, founded in 1494, had become a death trap. Diseases, conflicts with indigenous peoples, and poor planning had devastated the colony. Colonists were sick, mutinous, and desperate to return to Spain. But what if colonization was failing so badly? Why didn't Spain just give up? Ships carrying Spanish colonists arrived to find graves instead of gold. The dream of easy wealth was dying, and with it, the enthusiasm for settling the New World. Yet Spain's King Ferdinand couldn't abandon the Caribbean. Spain faced competition. Portugal was expanding in Africa and India. France was watching. If Spain pulled out now, rivals might fill the void. More importantly, the possibility of wealth, however distant, was too tempting. There were rumors of gold. There were reports of pearls. There were vast lands waiting to be exploited. Retreat was unthinkable for a nation desperate to expand its power and fill its treasury. The problem was clear. Columbus's approach wasn't working. He had governed poorly, failing to establish stable communities or functioning supply chains. His obsession with finding gold had blinded him to the necessity of creating sustainable towns. When Columbus returned to Spain for the last time in 1504, it was obvious that a new strategy was needed. The Spanish crown couldn't rely on explorers anymore. It needed administrators, soldiers, and settlers committed to building permanent communities. This realization led directly to 1503 and the decision to establish the first truly permanent Spanish settlements in the Americas. King Ferdinand appointed new governors and sent new fleets with specific instructions: build towns, establish order, exploit resources, and create stable colonies that would serve Spanish interests. Unlike Columbus's ventures, which were largely private expeditions sanctioned by the crown, these new efforts were direct imperial projects. The crown would invest resources and authority. In return, it would reap the benefits. The shift from exploration to colonization was subtle but complete. Explorers had been men seeking glory and fortune. Colonizers were soldiers, administrators, and families seeking to build permanent lives. They brought different skills, different expectations, and different survival strategies. They understood that the Caribbean wasn't a temporary trading post, it was a frontier to be claimed, controlled, and developed. This mindset, born from the lessons of Columbus's failures, defined Spanish colonization in 1503 and beyond. In 1501, King Ferdinand selected Nicolas de Ovando as governor of the Spanish Caribbean territories. This decision was transformative. Ovando was not an explorer or an adventurer. He was a military man, an administrator, and a strategist. He understood what settlements needed: order, discipline, infrastructure, and clear lines of authority. And here's the stunning part. Unlike the chaos under Columbus, Ovando's system actually worked. He saw chaos, mismanagement, and missed opportunities. Ovando's approach was revolutionary for its time: systematic colonization. Instead of allowing settlers to spread randomly across islands, he established planned towns with structured layouts. Instead of leaving food production to chance, he organized agriculture. Instead of tolerating disorder, he imposed military discipline. His vision was to transform the Caribbean into an extension of Spanish civilization, complete with towns modeled on Spanish patterns, hierarchical structures, and systems of control that would allow Spain to extract maximum wealth. In 1503, Ovando's strategy took concrete form when he established Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola. This wasn't just another settlement, it was the first truly planned European city in the New World. Santo Domingo had streets laid out in a grid pattern, fortifications for defense, government buildings, a church, and housing organized by social rank. It was as if a piece of Spain had been transplanted to the Caribbean. The city's design reflected Spanish Renaissance ideals of order and civilization. It announced to the world Spain had come to stay, and it would not be ruled by chaos. But Ovando understood something else crucial. Colonization required people. Empty towns meant nothing. He actively recruited settlers from Spain, offering land grants and the promise of wealth to those willing to leave their homes and take risks in the Caribbean. He also recognized that the indigenous labor force, the Taíno people, was essential to the colony's success. This recognition led to a catastrophic system, the encomienda, a form of labor organization that, while not quite slavery, would devastate indigenous populations. Ovando's vision was comprehensive. He didn't just build towns. He created a colonial society. He established churches to convert and control the indigenous population. He organized mining operations to extract gold. He developed agriculture, particularly sugar production, which would eventually transform the Caribbean economy. He created courts and administrative offices to enforce Spanish law. He built a military infrastructure to protect Spanish interests. Within a few years of his arrival, the Caribbean had been transformed from a chaotic frontier into an organized colonial system, and it all traced back to decisions made in 1503. The settlers who arrived in the Caribbean in 1503 and the years immediately following weren't conquistadors or adventurers seeking glory. They were ordinary Spaniard soldiers looking for steady pay, farmers seeking land, merchants hoping for trade opportunities, and families simply trying to build better lives. Some were fleeing poverty in Spain. Some were criminals given a choice between execution and exile. And many of them would be dead within a year. All of them faced an unknown, often hostile environment that tested their resilience daily. The journey itself was a trial by ordeal. Transatlantic voyages took 2 months or longer, packed into dark, disease-ridden ships where dysentery and other illnesses killed passengers with regularity. Those who survived arrival found themselves in a tropical world completely alien to Spanish experience. The climate was oppressively hot and humid. Diseases like malaria and yellow fever killed people within days of infection. The ecosystem was unfamiliar. Different plants, different animals, different weather patterns. Indigenous peoples, initially cooperative, became hostile as Spanish exploitation increased. Every day brought challenges that could kill you. Yet these settlers persisted, and their persistence created the foundation for Spanish colonization. They built homes, planted crops, raised livestock, and established the routines of daily life that transform a temporary settlement into a permanent community. They married and had children born on Caribbean soil, the first generation of Criollos people of Spanish descent, born in the Americas. They established markets, trade networks, and social hierarchies. They worshipped in churches, attended schools, and created the basic structures of European civilization in a tropical setting. The settlers themselves organized into clear social classes. At the top were the governors, military officers, and wealthy merchantmen who had connections to Spain or the colonial government. Below them were smaller merchants, craftspeople, and skilled workers. At the bottom were soldiers, laborers, and enslaved people. This hierarchy was strictly enforced. Your family name, your occupation, and your race determined everything about your life in the colony. Mobility was difficult, power concentrated at the top. But even the poorest settler understood something crucial. They were part of something larger than themselves. They were building a Spanish presence in the New World. The psychological transformation was equally important as the physical one. These settlers stopped thinking of themselves as temporary visitors and started thinking as colonists. They made investments, built businesses, and acquired land with the expectation they would be in the Caribbean for life. They fought against indigenous resistance, not as invaders, but as settlers defending their homes. They supported crown policies, not because they were ordered to, but because these policies protected their interests. By 1505 and 1506, the colonial mindset was firmly established. What had started as exploration was becoming colonization, and these ordinary settlers were its architects. Spain's investment in Caribbean colonization would never have continued if the colonies remained unprofitable. By 1503, it was becoming clear that the region held wealth not necessarily in the gold quantities Columbus had promised, but in exploitable resources. Sugarcane had been introduced to the islands. Indigenous labor was abundant. Land was available for the taking. But here's the dark truth. The colonists understood exactly what they were: building a machine designed to turn human beings into profit. The encomienda system emerged as that mechanism. Under this system, Spanish settlers received grants of land, along with the right to demand labor from specific groups of indigenous people. In theory, the settlers, called encomenderos, were obligated to protect, house, feed, and Christianize the indigenous workers assigned to them. In practice, it was a system of brutal exploitation that extracted labor without providing adequate compensation or care. Indigenous people worked in mines, sugar fields, and agricultural operations under harsh conditions, without meaningful rights or protections. They could be beaten, could be worked to death, and had no legal recourse. The encomienda system created enormous wealth for Spanish settlers and the crown. Gold mining, though less productive than Columbus had promised, still generated significant wealth, but it was sugar production that would eventually drive the Caribbean economy. Sugarcane requires enormous amounts of labor to plant, harvest, and process. The profits from sugar were extraordinary for those who controlled production. By 1510, sugar plantations were already operating on Hispaniola. By 1520, sugar would become the economic engine of Spanish Caribbean colonization. This system depended on an abundant labor force, and that meant indigenous people. When the indigenous population declined due to disease, overwork, and violence, a catastrophe that was already becoming apparent, by 1505 Spanish colonists sought alternatives. They began importing enslaved people from Africa, though this practice was still limited in the early 1500s. The transatlantic slave trade, one of history's greatest horrors, found its first justification in the labor demands of Caribbean plantations. It began in the early years of colonization, with roots tracing directly back to 1503. The economic system established in 1503 and following years created a colonial structure that would persist for centuries. At its core was the exploitation of land and labor for the benefit of Spanish settlers and the Spanish crown. Profits were extracted and shipped to Spain. Some wealth stayed in the colonies, creating a colonial elite. But the system's fundamental purpose was to enrich Spain. For centuries, this system would shape Caribbean life, creating wealth for colonizers and devastation for colonized peoples. It was capitalism in its rawest form, driven by profit, enabled by power, and dependent on the dehumanization of those who had no choice. The arrival of Spanish settlers in 1503 and the establishment of permanent communities spelled catastrophe for the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. The Taino people, who had lived on these islands for centuries in relatively peaceful societies, had no defenses against what was coming. They had not experienced the diseases that plagued Europe. They had no immunity to smallpox, measles, influenza, or the countless other pathogens that European bodies carried. To put this in perspective, in less than 50 years, an entire civilization that had thrived for 1,000 years was completely erased. But disease was only part of the tragedy. The Spanish also brought violence, enslavement, and cultural destruction. Indigenous people were forced to work under the encomienda system in conditions that killed them. They were subjected to violence when they resisted Spanish demands. Their religious practices were suppressed in favor of Christianity. Their culture was treated as primitive and inferior. Spanish settlers, convinced of their civilization's superiority, saw themselves as bringing enlightenment to a savage land. To the indigenous peoples experiencing the reality, it felt like apocalypse. The demographic collapse was staggering. Hispaniola, where Columbus had first established settlements, had an indigenous population estimated at between 250,000 and 1 million people in 1492. By 1510, fewer than 100,000 remained. By 1550, the indigenous population was virtually extinct. The Taíno civilization, which had flourished for centuries, was destroyed in a single generation. Similar patterns unfolded on other Caribbean islands. Populations that had existed for hundreds of years disappeared within decades. Spanish observers noticed this catastrophe, but interpreted it differently than we would today. Some saw it as God's will, proof that indigenous peoples were meant to be subordinate to Christian Europeans. Others viewed it as an unfortunate side effect of colonization that needed to be addressed by importing new labor sources, which led to the Atlantic slave trade. Few colonists questioned whether colonization itself was justified, or whether the violence and exploitation were morally defensible. The tragedy of 1503 and the years that followed was not merely the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, though that was a catastrophe of immeasurable proportions. It was also the erasure of civilizations, the theft of lands, the destruction of cultures, and the imposition of a colonial system that would define the Caribbean for centuries. The indigenous peoples of 1503 could not have imagined the scale of the disaster that would unfold. They could not have known that the arrival of Spanish settlers meant the end of their world. All they experienced was confusion, disease, violence, and death, and an inability to stop any of it. The settlement established in 1503 was not the end of Spanish colonial expansion, it was the beginning. The methods, structures, and systems developed in the Caribbean would be replicated and refined as Spain conquered and colonized vast territories across the Americas. The grid-pattern town design that Ovando established in Santo Domingo became the template for Spanish cities across Central and South America. The encomienda system spread from the Caribbean to Mexico, Peru, and beyond, and most critically, the business model of extracting wealth and shipping it home would define the entire colonial Americas for 400 years. The Caribbean colonization in 1503 also established patterns that other European powers would copy. When England, France, and the Netherlands began colonizing the Americas in the 1600s, they often borrowed Spanish colonial models. They established towns, extracted resources, developed plantations, and brought enslaved labor from Africa. The Caribbean became a laboratory for European colonization, and the lessons learned there were applied globally. The British colonies that would eventually become the United States inherited colonial structures and slavery systems that originated in 1503. More broadly, 1503 marks the moment when European colonization of the Americas became irreversible and systematic. Before 1503, colonization was tentative, uncertain, and dependent on individual explorers. After 1503, it was imperial policy, backed by royal authority, invested with state resources, and guided by bureaucratic systems. The colonies that Spain established would last until the 1800s. The wealth extracted would help fund Spain's rise as a global power. The colonial societies created would persist as independent nations after Spain lost political control. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, 1503 represents the beginning of 5 centuries of colonization, exploitation, and marginalization. The demographic catastrophe that unfolded in the Caribbean set a terrible precedent that would be repeated across the Americas. The systems of labor exploitation established in 1503 would persist in modified forms until modern times. The cultural suppression, religious conversion, and erasure of indigenous identity that began in 1503 would continue as long as colonial rule persisted. Understanding 1503 is crucial for understanding the Americas, the United States, which would emerge from British colonies in North America. Inherited colonial systems, racial hierarchies, and economic structures that originated in Spanish Caribbean colonization. The political boundaries, cultural divisions, and economic inequalities that characterize the Americas today all trace back, in part, to decisions made and actions taken in 1503. That year marked the moment when Europe permanently claimed the Americas as its own, beginning a transformation that would reshape the entire world. It was a turning point that would echo through 5 centuries of history, affecting billions of lives in ways we continue to experience today.